The bell echoed through the quiet halls of Ridgewood High School as students shuffled into their English class, clutching their essays with varying degrees of confidence. The class had a reputation for being one of the toughest in the school, led by Mr. Whitaker, a middle-aged teacher known for his no-nonsense demeanor and meticulous grading. His sharp eyes seemed to dissect every word on a page, and he rarely handed out praise. Many students dreaded his feedback, knowing he expected perfection. Seated near the back of the room was Michael, a reserved yet intelligent young man who rarely spoke unless called upon. His confidence in writing was unshakable, but he knew better than to expect recognition in this class. Michael was one of the few black students in the predominantly white school, and while he'd faced subtle and overt challenges, he always held his head high. He had grown accustomed to the double takes, the skeptical glances, and the unspoken assumptions about his abilities. As the students handed in their essays, Mr. Whitaker collected the papers without a word, his face as unreadable as ever. Michael watched him out of the corner of his eye, unsure what to expect from the essay he'd poured his heart into. It wasn't just any essay, it was a deeply personal piece about his family's journey, their struggles, and the resilience that had shaped his identity. Writing it had felt cathartic, almost like a conversation with his ancestors. A few days later, the essays were returned. Mr. Whitaker's feedback was written in red ink, sharp and precise. When Michael saw his essay, his stomach tightened. Instead of the detailed commentary he had expected, there was a single line scrawled across the top: "See me after class." The phrase lingered in Michael's mind throughout the lesson, gnawing at his confidence. He couldn't focus on the discussion about classic American literature, nor could he engage in the group activity. He kept glancing at the clock, dreading the moment the bell would ring. Finally, class ended, and the room emptied out, leaving Michael and Mr. Whitaker alone. The teacher leaned back in his chair, holding Michael's essay in his hand. His expression was stern, his gaze unwavering. "This essay," Mr. Whitaker began, tapping the paper, "is exceptional. Almost too exceptional." Michael furrowed his brow, unsure of what he meant. "Where did you get this from?" Mr. Whitaker asked bluntly. "Did you copy it? Have someone else write it for you?" The accusation hit Michael like a punch to the gut. His face burned with indignation, but he tried to keep his composure. "I wrote it," he replied firmly, meeting Mr. Whitaker's gaze. Mr. Whitaker raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "It's hard to believe, Michael. This essay doesn't match your previous work. The depth, the voice, it feels advanced." Michael clenched his fists, willing himself to stay calm. "You don't believe I'm capable of writing something like this?" "It's not about belief," Mr. Whitaker replied, his tone measured. "It's about consistency. This doesn't align with what I've seen from you in the past. I'm going to need proof." "Proof?" Michael repeated, his voice rising slightly. "How am I supposed to prove I wrote it?" Mr. Whitaker placed the essay down and folded his hands on his desk. "I'd like you to write another piece here and now. Same topic, same depth. If you can produce something similar, we'll move forward." Michael's heart sank. He knew he could write, but being asked to replicate something so deeply personal on the spot felt like an impossible task. Writing took time, reflection, and the right state of mind, none of which he had at that moment. "Can't you just take my word for it?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Mr. Whitaker didn't budge. "I'm afraid that's not how it works. If you're as talented as this essay suggests, you'll have no problem proving it." Michael stared at him, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent his whole life defying expectations, but this felt different. This wasn't just about proving his talent, it was about defending his integrity. Reluctantly, he sat down at a desk, took a deep breath, and began to write. The room was silent except for the faint scratch of pen on paper. Mr. Whitaker watched him closely, his expression unreadable. Michael's mind raced as he tried to channel the same emotions he had felt while writing the original essay. The words came slowly at first, but soon they began to flow, each sentence carrying the weight of his experiences and the pride he held for his heritage. When he finished, he placed the paper on Mr. Whitaker's desk without a word. The teacher picked it up and began to read, his eyes scanning the page with the same intensity as before. As the minutes ticked by, Michael's anxiety grew. He couldn't tell what Mr. Whitaker was thinking, and the silence was unbearable. Finally, the teacher looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and contemplation. "This is remarkable," he admitted, though there was still a hint of doubt in his voice. "But I'm going to need more time to evaluate." Michael nodded, though his frustration was evident. "Take all the time you need," he said, his voice firm. Over the next week, the tension between Michael and Mr. Whitaker was palpable. Word had spread among the students that Michael's essay was under scrutiny, and whispers followed him through the hallways. Some students were supportive, while others questioned his abilities. Michael tried to focus on his other classes, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. He knew he had done nothing wrong, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being unfairly judged. Then, one day after class, Mr. Whitaker called him back again. This time, his demeanor was different, less stern, more curious. "I did some research," he began, holding both essays in his hand. "And I reached out to a colleague who specializes in creative writing. They were impressed by your work, but they also mentioned something interesting. The way you write, the themes you explore, it's not just good, Michael. It's extraordinary." They said it reminded them of some of the best Pulitzer-winning essays they've seen. Michael blinked, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't set out to win anyone's approval, let alone be compared to Pulitzer Prize winners. "I need to know," Mr. Whitaker continued, his tone almost pleading. "What drives you to write like this? Where does this talent come from?" Michael took a deep breath, finally feeling the weight of the moment lift slightly. "It comes from my family, my experiences, and everything I've been through. Writing is how I make sense of it all. It's how I honor the people who came before me." Mr. Whitaker nodded slowly, as if finally beginning to understand. But before he could say anything else, the classroom door opened, and the principal walked in, holding a letter. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice brisk, "we just received this. It's for Michael." Michael took the letter, his hands trembling slightly. He opened it and read the first few lines, his eyes widening in disbelief. "What is it?" Mr. Whitaker asked, his curiosity piqued. Michael looked up, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's an invitation to the National Writing Competition Finals. My essay was submitted by someone I don't know who, and they think I have a real shot." The room fell silent as the weight of the revelation sank in. Mr. Whitaker's expression softened, and for the first time, he looked at Michael not with doubt, but with genuine respect. But before Michael could process the moment, the principal added, "There's one more thing. A representative from a major publication will be attending the finals, and they're interested in speaking with you about your work." Michael's heart raced. The opportunity was incredible, but it also brought new challenges and uncertainties. As he stood there, clutching the letter, he realized this was just the beginning of a journey that would test him in ways he hadn't yet imagined. And as Mr. Whitaker watched him leave the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had underestimated his student in ways he would spend a long time making up for. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Michael. His classmates noticed something different about him, but he wasn't ready to share the details. The weight of the letter in his backpack felt like both a victory and a challenge. A part of him was thrilled this was recognition beyond anything he had expected. Yet another part of him couldn't shake the unease of how it all came to this. Mr. Whitaker's doubts, the whispered rumors, and now the looming competition all swirled in his mind, making it hard to focus on anything else. When he got home, his mother was waiting in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour from rolling out dough for dinner. She gave him a quick smile but noticed the tension in his shoulders. Everything okay, sweetheart? She asked, brushing her hands off and turning to him fully. Michael hesitated. He wanted to tell her about the letter, the competition, and what it could mean for him. But there was also a part of him that felt exposed, as if sharing the news would make it more real and the stakes even higher. I'm fine, he said, dropping his bag by the door. Just a lot on my mind. She studied him for a moment, then nodded, sensing he wasn't ready to talk. Well, dinner's in an hour. If you want to help, I could use an extra set of hands. Michael offered her a small smile and joined her at the counter, the rhythmic act of kneading dough providing a brief escape from his thoughts. But as the evening wore on, the letter kept calling to him. Finally, after dinner, he took it out and read it again, tracing each word with his finger. The National Writing Competition wasn't just any event. It was one of the most prestigious platforms for young writers, a place where aspiring authors could gain recognition and opportunities that might otherwise take years to achieve. Michael's stomach tightened as he thought about what it would mean to stand in front of judges, knowing they were evaluating his story and, by extension, a piece of who he was. That night he barely slept. His mind raced with possibilities, fears, and the memory of Mr. Whitaker's face when he'd read the essay. Despite their rocky history, Michael couldn't deny that his teacher's acknowledgement carried weight. But he also couldn't forget the way he had been doubted, as if his talent couldn't possibly belong to someone like him. The next morning, Michael arrived at school early, hoping to avoid the curious glances and whispered questions from his peers. But as he walked down the hallway, he noticed a group of students clustered near the bulletin board. They were talking animatedly, pointing at something posted there. Michael's heart sank as he got closer and saw what it was, his name. The school had apparently decided to announce his participation in the competition, framing it as a point of pride for Ridgewood High. A glossy flyer featured his name in bold letters, alongside a short description of the event. Michael felt a mix of pride and discomfort. He hadn't even processed the news himself, and now everyone seemed to know about it. Michael, hey! One of his classmates called out, jogging over to him. Is it true? You're going to the finals for that big writing thing? Michael forced a smile. Yeah, I guess. That's insane, the classmate said, clearly impressed. I didn't even know you were into writing like that. Michael shrugged, unsure how to respond. It wasn't that he hid his love for writing, but it had always been something personal, a way to process his thoughts and tell the stories that mattered to him. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. As the day went on, the news spread further. Teachers congratulated him in passing, and even students who rarely spoke to him seemed eager to share their admiration. But not everyone was supportive. Michael overheard a group of students in the cafeteria questioning whether he deserved the recognition. Maybe he got lucky, one of them said, his voice dripping with skepticism. Or maybe someone helped him. Michael's stomach churned, but he forced himself to keep walking, pretending he hadn't heard. He had dealt with comments like this before, assumptions that he couldn't possibly achieve something on his own merit. But it didn't make them any easier to ignore. By the time English class rolled around, Michael felt like he was walking into a lion's den. The weight of everyone's expectations and doubts pressed down on him as he took his seat. Mr. Whitaker glanced at him briefly but didn't say anything as he began the lesson. Michael wondered if his teacher had something to say about the letter, but the class ended without any mention of it. As the students filed out, Mr. Whitaker called Michael over. A word, please. Michael's pulse quickened as he approached the desk. Yes, sir? Mr. Whitaker looked at him for a long moment before speaking. I wanted to say congratulations. The competition is a big deal, and it's clear you've worked hard to get here. Michael nodded, unsure of what to say. Thank you. But Mr. Whitaker continued, his tone measured. I want you to be prepared. Events like this can be overwhelming, especially when you're under the kind of scrutiny that comes with being in the spotlight. Are you ready for that? The question caught Michael off guard. He hadn't thought much about the actual competition beyond the fear of standing in front of the judges. "I think so," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Mr. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You have a gift, Michael. But talent alone isn't enough. You need to believe in yourself, even when others doubt you. Especially then." Michael's chest tightened. He appreciated the sentiment, but it also felt ironic coming from the man who had doubted him so openly just days ago. Still, he nodded, knowing there was truth in the words. As he left the classroom, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Whitaker's approval wasn't the validation he truly needed. The competition wasn't just about proving himself to the judges or his teacher, it was about reclaiming his own confidence and sense of worth. Over the next week, Michael threw himself into preparing for the competition. He spent hours revising his essay, fine-tuning every word and sentence until it felt perfect. But the more he worked, the more he began to second-guess himself. What if the judges didn't connect with his story? What if his best wasn't enough? One evening, as he sat at his desk staring at the pages in front of him, his younger sister peeked into his room. "Hey," she said, stepping inside. "Mom said you've been working a lot lately?" Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, I have this competition coming up. It's kind of a big deal." His sister sat down on the edge of his bed, her wide eyes full of curiosity. "Can I read what you wrote?" Michael hesitated. Sharing his work always felt vulnerable, even with family. But something about her earnestness made him hand over the pages. She read silently, her expression shifting as she took in the words. When she finished, she looked up at him, her eyes shining. "This is amazing, Michael. It's like I can feel everything you're saying." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Coming from someone who knew him so well, they felt genuine and unfiltered. For the first time in days, Michael felt a flicker of confidence. "Thanks," he said, his voice soft. "You're going to do great," she added, her tone certain. "I know it." Michael nodded, her encouragement giving him a renewed sense of purpose. But as he watched her leave the room, he couldn't help but wonder if belief in himself would be enough to carry him through the challenges ahead. As the day of the competition drew closer, the suspense grew thicker. Michael felt like he was walking a tightrope, balancing between hope and doubt. The mystery of how his essay had been submitted lingered in the back of his mind, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already overwhelming experience. Who had believed in him enough to take that step? And what would they expect of him now? The answers, Michael realized, would only come with time. For now, he could only focus on the next step and hope that his voice would be enough to rise above the noise. The day of the competition arrived, bringing with it a whirlwind of nerves and excitement. Michael woke up early, unable to sleep through the anticipation. The house was quieter than usual, as if his family understood the weight of the moment and didn't want to disturb him. His mother had laid out a crisp shirt and tie for him, a silent gesture of her support. On the way to the event, the car ride was filled with a mix of small talk and silence. Michael stared out the window, watching the scenery blur past. His mother occasionally glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her eyes full of quiet encouragement. His younger sister had tagged along, bouncing slightly in her seat, clearly more excited than nervous. As they pulled up to the venue, Michael's stomach flipped. The building was much larger than he had imagined, its towering glass windows reflecting the early morning sun. He could see groups of students and their families gathered near the entrance, their chatter and laughter adding to the charged atmosphere. Michael clutched his essay folder tightly, the weight of his words feeling heavier than ever. Inside, the air buzzed with energy. Students from all over the country filled the hall, each one holding their own carefully crafted stories. The diversity of faces and voices reminded Michael that this was more than just a competition, it was a gathering of storytellers, each with a unique perspective to share. Yet, instead of feeling reassured, Michael felt the pressure mount. These weren't just peers, they were competitors. He checked in at the registration table, receiving a badge with his name and school printed on it. The staff directed him to the waiting area for participants, where rows of chairs were set up in a sprawling room. Michael found an empty seat near the back and sank into it, his heart racing. Around him, other students were chatting, some flipping through their essays for last-minute edits, while others sat silently, their faces pale with nerves. Michael's thoughts drifted to the essay he had written, the story that had carried him to this point. It was deeply personal, a reflection of his experiences and the lessons he had learned. He had poured his heart into every word, but now, surrounded by so many talented individuals, he wondered if it would be enough. The doubt crept in like a shadow, dark and persistent. Just as he was beginning to spiral, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Michael?" He looked up to see Mr. Whitaker standing in the doorway, a slight smile on his face. Michael blinked, stunned. He hadn't expected to see his teacher here. "I thought I'd come to support you," Mr. Whitaker said, walking over. "This is a big day, after all." Michael nodded slowly, unsure of how to feel. The last time they had spoken, Mr. Whitaker's words had been encouraging but tinged with doubt. Seeing him here now felt like a mix of validation and added pressure. "I know this is overwhelming," Mr. Whitaker said, sitting down beside him. "But remember, you've already accomplished something incredible just by being here. No one can take that away from you." Michael swallowed hard, trying to absorb the reassurance. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Before they could say more, an announcement crackled over the speakers, calling all participants to the main hall. Michael's pulse quickened as he stood, clutching his folder tightly. Mr. Whitaker gave him a firm nod, as if to say, "You've got this." The main hall was a grand space, with a raised stage at one end and rows of chairs arranged in neat lines. The judges sat at a long table in front of the stage, their expressions calm but focused. Michael's eyes darted to the audience, spotting his mother and sister near the back. His sister waved enthusiastically, her grin wide enough to make him smile despite his nerves. The first round of the competition involved presenting their essays aloud. Michael's name was somewhere in the middle of the list, giving him time to observe the other participants. One by one, students stepped onto the stage, their voices carrying stories of love, loss, hope, and resilience. Each presentation was met with polite applause, but Michael couldn't help noticing the subtle reactions of the judges, the nods, the scribbled notes, the occasional murmurs. When his name was finally called, Michael's legs felt like lead as he walked to the stage. The microphone loomed in front of him, a stark reminder of how exposed he was. He took a deep breath and looked out at the sea of faces, his heart hammering in his chest. As he began to read, his voice wavered, but he pushed through, focusing on the words he had spent so much time perfecting. The room seemed to shrink around him, the background noise fading until it was just him and the story. He poured himself into the delivery, letting the emotions behind his words shine through. By the time he finished, his palms were damp, and his throat was dry, but he had done it. The applause that followed was polite but not thunderous. Michael stepped down from the stage, his mind racing with self-doubt. Had he done enough? Did his story resonate the way he hoped it would? Back in his seat, Michael barely noticed the remaining participants as they took their turns. His thoughts were consumed by the judges' expressions, the subtle shifts in their posture as they listened. He couldn't tell if their reactions to his essay had been positive or indifferent, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. When the first round ended, the judges announced a short break before revealing the finalists. Michael joined his family in the lobby, where his mother pulled him into a hug. "You were amazing," she said, her voice filled with pride. "I don't know," Michael murmured, his eyes on the ground. "It didn't feel like enough." His sister frowned, tugging at his sleeve. "You can't think like that. You told your story, and that's what matters." Mr. Whitaker appeared a moment later, his expression unreadable. You held your own up there, Michael, he said. No matter what happens next, you should be proud. Michael nodded, but his chest felt tight. The suspense of waiting for the results was almost unbearable. He found himself pacing the lobby, the minutes dragging on like hours. Around him, other participants were engaged in similar rituals of nervous energy, some pacing, others huddled with their families, their faces tense. Finally, the announcement came. The participants were called back into the hall, where the judges stood on the stage, their expressions solemn. One of them stepped forward, holding a sheet of paper that seemed to hold the weight of the world. Michael's heart pounded as the judge began to speak, her voice clear and steady. She commended all the participants for their bravery and talent, but Michael barely heard her words. He was focused on the list she held, the names that would determine his next steps. When the judge began to read the names of the finalists, Michael felt his breath catch. One by one, the names were called, each one accompanied by cheers and applause. The tension in the room was palpable, every participant holding their breath. Michael's name hadn't been called yet. The list was nearly complete, and his chest tightened with every passing second. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he waited for the final name to be announced. The judge paused, scanning the list as the tension in the room became unbearable. Michael felt his chest tighten, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a storm cloud ready to burst. His name wasn't on the list yet, and with only one spot left, it felt as though the entire room held its breath alongside him. When the final name was called, it wasn't his. The applause that followed felt distant and hollow, like an echo in a cavern. Michael stood frozen, his hands limp at his sides. He barely registered his mother's gentle hand on his shoulder or his sister's whispered words of encouragement. All he could hear was the rush of blood in his ears and the heavy thud of his heart. He had poured everything into this moment, and now it was slipping through his fingers. But just as he turned to leave, the head judge raised her hand, signaling for quiet. Before we move on, there's something I'd like to address, she said, her voice calm but commanding. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. Michael stopped mid-step, his pulse quickening again. The judge's expression softened as she glanced at the audience, then back at the participants. In reviewing the essays submitted for this competition, we came across one piece that stood out not just for its quality, but for the story behind it. It's rare that a submission raises questions beyond its content, but this one did. Michael's confusion deepened. What was she talking about? Around him, murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of curiosity and unease. This essay was questioned for its authenticity, the judge continued, her gaze steady. Not because of plagiarism, but because of its exceptional depth and skill. It was hard to believe it was written by a student. Her words hung in the air like a thunderclap, sending a jolt through Michael's chest. He felt the room shift, the eyes of participants and audience members darting around, trying to identify who she meant. His palms grew clammy, and his throat felt dry. Could she be talking about him? The judge's next words confirmed it. Michael, could you please come to the stage? The sound of his name sent a wave of shock through him. His legs felt like lead as he walked toward the stage, his steps slow and deliberate. The whispers grew louder, a hum of speculation and surprise that seemed to follow him like a shadow. He could feel Mr. Whitaker's gaze on him, but he didn't dare look back. When he reached the stage, the judge smiled warmly, though her eyes held a seriousness that made his stomach twist. Michael, your essay was extraordinary. It moved us deeply. But its level of sophistication raised questions. We wanted to understand more about your inspiration and process. Michael's mind raced. He had written every word himself, drawing from his experiences and emotions. The idea that someone might doubt his work left him feeling both defensive and exposed. I wrote it, he stammered, his voice barely audible through the microphone. The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. We don't doubt your honesty, Michael. But we'd like you to read a portion of your essay again, here, in front of everyone. Michael's chest tightened further. He hadn't prepared for this. His nerves, already frayed, threatened to unravel completely. But he nodded, his hands trembling as he took the folded essay from his pocket. His fingers brushed the paper's edges, the texture grounding him in the moment. As he began to read, the room once again seemed to shrink, the audience and judges blurring into the background. The words flowed from him with the same passion and conviction he had felt while writing them. His voice grew steadier with each sentence, the emotions behind his story spilling into the air like a wave washing over the crowd. When he finished, the room was silent. Not the kind of silence that followed polite applause, but a deeper, heavier silence filled with awe and reflection. Michael's breath hitched as he waited, his pulse loud in his ears. The judge leaned forward, her expression softer now. "Thank you, Michael. That was beautiful. I believe we all needed to hear that again." She turned to address the audience and the other judges. "Let this be a reminder that talent and authenticity come in many forms. Sometimes, it challenges our assumptions in ways we don't expect." The applause that followed was different this time, louder, warmer, and filled with genuine appreciation. Michael stood frozen, the weight of the moment crashing over him. For the first time, he saw the judges smile, their earlier doubt replaced with admiration. But just as he began to feel a flicker of relief, another voice cut through the applause. It was one of the other participants, standing near the front of the audience. "Wait," the boy said, his tone sharp. "If his essay was so good, why didn't he make the finalist list?" The question sent a ripple through the crowd, the tension snapping back into place like a taut wire. Michael's stomach dropped as he turned to the judges, their expressions shifting uneasily. The boy's challenge hung in the air, a stark reminder that not everyone in the room was convinced. The head judge hesitated, her confident demeanor faltering for the first time. "That's a fair question," she admitted. "Michael's essay was exceptional, but it didn't fit neatly into the categories we were judging. It's a reminder that sometimes, even great work can defy expectations." The explanation didn't sit well with everyone. Michael could feel the skepticism radiating from some of the other participants, their whispers growing louder. Doubt and tension filled the room once more, threatening to overshadow the moment of triumph he had just experienced. Before anyone could speak again, Mr. Whitaker stood up from his seat, his voice cutting through the noise. "Excuse me," he said, his tone firm but calm. "I'd like to say something." The crowd turned toward him, their curiosity piqued. Michael's heart raced as he watched his teacher walk toward the stage, his presence commanding attention. Whatever Mr. Whitaker was about to say, Michael knew it would either quell the unrest or fan the flames even higher. The stakes had never felt so high, and Michael realized that his journey was far from over. Mr. Whitaker's presence on the stage immediately quieted the murmurs in the room. His usually reserved demeanor was now replaced by a quiet determination as he adjusted the microphone. Michael watched, unsure if his teacher's intervention would bring clarity or deepen the tension. The crowd leaned in, eager for answers. "When I first read Michael's essay," Mr. Whitaker began, his voice steady, "I doubted him." His admission sent a ripple through the audience, their whispers reigniting. Michael's cheeks burned with embarrassment, the sting of those early doubts still fresh in his memory. "I doubted that someone so young could write with such depth, with such perspective," Mr. Whitaker continued. "I even questioned if it was truly his own work. And that," he said, turning slightly toward Michael, "was my failure, not his." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Michael's heart pounded as he fought the urge to shrink under the scrutiny. "But let me tell you what I've learned since then," Mr. Whitaker said, his tone softening. Michael's essay was not just a collection of words. It was a reflection of his life, his struggles, and his resilience. The kind of writing that can only come from someone who has truly lived through those moments. He paused, scanning the crowd as though daring anyone to challenge him. What makes Michael's work extraordinary isn't just his talent. It's the raw honesty, the vulnerability, and the courage it takes to put his story on paper. That is something no one should ever doubt. The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of validation that brought tears to Michael's eyes. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. But as the applause died down, one of the judges stood, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Whitaker, thank you for your perspective," she said, her voice carrying a hint of curiosity. "But I think we're all wondering what was it in Michael's essay that was so exceptional, so unique, that it caused this much debate? Could you share more specifics?" Michael felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The essay he had written was deeply personal, a raw account of moments he hadn't shared with anyone else. The idea of having those details exposed to a room full of strangers made him feel vulnerable in a way he wasn't prepared for. Before he could respond, Mr. Whitaker glanced at him, as if silently asking for permission. Michael hesitated but eventually nodded. If his story was going to be judged, it deserved to be fully understood. Mr. Whitaker cleared his throat and began. Michael's essay wasn't just about overcoming obstacles. It was about redefining what those obstacles meant. He wrote about growing up in a world that constantly underestimated him. About how the labels placed on him didn't just limit him, they inspired him to prove everyone wrong. The room grew quieter, the tension shifting to a different kind of intensity. Mr. Whitaker continued. He wrote about a teacher who doubted him, someone who should have been his ally but became another hurdle to overcome. And yet, instead of letting that experience define him, he used it as fuel. His words were a reminder that greatness often comes from places people least expect. Michael felt his throat tighten. He hadn't known Mr. Whitaker would see himself so clearly in the story, nor had he anticipated how deeply it would resonate with others. The silence in the room was now charged with something new, a collective reflection that made everyone feel the weight of their own assumptions. One of the judges broke the silence, her voice tinged with awe. "Michael, your essay wasn't just a piece of writing. It was a challenge, a call for all of us to confront our biases and do better. I think everyone here owes you an apology for ever doubting your brilliance." The applause that followed was different this time, a standing ovation that left Michael overwhelmed. But just as he began to feel the rush of vindication, the unexpected twist came. From the back of the room, a man stood up, a reporter who had been quietly observing the event. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I've been following this story closely, and I think there's something important everyone here should know." The room turned toward him, the sudden shift in attention creating a new tension. Michael's heart raced as the man walked toward the stage, carrying a folder. He handed it to the head judge, who opened it with a frown. The judge's expression shifted from confusion to shock as she read the contents. She looked up at the reporter, then back at Michael. "It seems," she began carefully, "that Michael's essay has caught more attention than we realized. Not only was it exceptional, but it's now being considered for a major literary award." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Michael's mind reeled as the judge continued. "This isn't just about this competition anymore. Your work has touched people far beyond these walls, Michael. And it seems your story is just beginning." The realization hit Michael like a wave. What had started as a simple essay had grown into something far larger, a testament to the power of storytelling and the resilience of the human spirit. As the audience applauded again, he looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some not, and felt something he hadn't expected: hope. The journey that had begun with doubt and skepticism had led to a moment of triumph, not just for Michael, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated. And as he stood there, basking in the applause, he knew that his story wasn't just his own. It was a reminder that the power of words could change minds, challenge perceptions, and inspire change. As the applause began to fade, Michael found himself standing in a surreal moment of clarity. Everything that had transpired, the doubts, the accusations, the revelations, had brought him to this point. The room was alive with murmurs of admiration and wonder, and for the first time, Michael felt like he truly belonged, not just in this space but in the world of writers and thinkers who dared to challenge perceptions. The head judge leaned into the microphone, her voice cutting through the lingering hum of the crowd. Michael, while this competition was meant to showcase talent, you've done something extraordinary. Your work has not only inspired us but also set a new standard for what it means to write from the heart. We are proud to declare you the winner of this year's competition. The cheers erupted again, but this time they felt different. They weren't just a reaction to the announcement, they were a celebration of Michael himself. He stood there, stunned, unsure if he should laugh, cry, or simply bask in the moment. After the crowd settled, the reporter who had delivered the unexpected news earlier approached Michael with a warm smile. You know, he said, lowering his voice so only Michael could hear, you're not just a winner here. Your story has already reached people beyond this room. There's a growing interest in your voice, in what you have to say. Don't be surprised if opportunities start knocking soon. Michael nodded, still trying to process everything. The reporter handed him a business card and gave him an encouraging pat on the shoulder before stepping away. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Strangers approached Michael, each one eager to share how his story had resonated with them. Some spoke of their own struggles, while others admitted that his words had made them rethink their own assumptions. Michael listened to each one, humbled and grateful, though part of him still felt like an observer in his own life. Mr. Whitaker, who had remained respectfully in the background after his speech, finally approached as the room began to empty. He looked at Michael with an expression that was hard to decipher: pride, guilt, and perhaps even a hint of awe. I owe you an apology, Mr. Whitaker said, his voice heavy with sincerity. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I failed to see the brilliance in front of me. You've taught me more than I could ever teach you, Michael. Thank you for giving me the chance to make it right. Michael didn't know how to respond at first. He had spent weeks grappling with the hurt caused by his teacher's initial doubts, but standing here now, he realized that holding on to that anger would only weigh him down. Thank you for standing up for me tonight, he finally said. That meant a lot. Mr. Whitaker nodded, his eyes glistening. I'll be rooting for you, Michael. Always. As the room cleared out, Michael found himself alone for a moment, clutching the plaque he had been awarded. He looked down at it, the weight of it grounding him in the reality of what had just happened. It wasn't just a trophy, it was a symbol of everything he had overcome. Walking outside into the crisp night air, Michael felt a strange sense of calm. The sky was clear, the stars scattered across it like a reminder of how vast the world truly was. For so long, he had felt small, insignificant, but tonight had changed that. He had found his voice, and more importantly, he had been heard. Over the next few weeks, life shifted in ways Michael could never have anticipated. The recognition from the competition opened doors he hadn't even known existed. Invitations to speak at events, offers to publish his work, and messages of support from strangers flooded in. Each new opportunity felt like a confirmation that his story mattered, that he mattered. But with the success came challenges, too. The attention was overwhelming at times, and Michael struggled with the pressure to live up to expectations. There were moments when he doubted himself, moments when the old insecurities crept back in. Yet, every time he felt that weight, he remembered the people who had been moved by his words, and it gave him the strength to keep going. One day, months after the competition, Michael received an email that stood out from the rest. It was from a Pulitzer Prize winning author who had read his essay and wanted to collaborate on a project. The author's words were filled with admiration and encouragement, and the opportunity felt like a dream come true. As he sat in his small bedroom, staring at the email, Michael thought back to the moment when Mr. Whitaker had first questioned his work. What if he had given up then? What if he had let the doubts consume him? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Michael realized that his journey wasn't just about proving others wrong, it was about proving himself right. His story wasn't just his own anymore, It was a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of believing in oneself, even when others don't. The collaboration with the Pulitzer Prize winning author turned into a book that became a bestseller, earning Michael even more recognition. But beyond the accolades and the success, what mattered most to him was the impact his words had on people. Letters poured in from readers who shared how his story had inspired them to chase their dreams, to confront their own doubts, and to believe in their potential. Years later, as Michael stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, accepting an award for his latest work, he thought about how far he had come. He thought about the teacher who had once doubted him, the judges who had questioned his authenticity, and the reporter who had believed in him before he believed in himself. Looking out at the sea of faces, Michael smiled. "If there's one thing I've learned," he said into the microphone, his voice steady and clear, "it's that your story is your power. Don't ever let anyone take that away from you. And don't be afraid to write your own ending." The audience erupted into applause, but Michael barely heard it. He was too busy reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, a journey of doubt, perseverance, and triumph. It wasn't a perfect journey, but it was his, and that was more than enough.